The unexpected encounter. The early evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood, bathing Cedar Avenue in a warm amber glow. Officer Jake Mercer's patrol car moved slowly down the familiar streets of his beat. He had been patrolling this part of town for nearly a decade and took comfort in the predictability of it all. Well-kept homes, peaceful parks, and friendly waves from the locals he'd come to know over the years. Today, however, something was different. It was an instinct, a sense he had developed over his years in service. Something was off. As he neared the intersection of Cedar and Pine, he caught sight of movement in a nearby alleyway. A young boy, perhaps 11 or 12, stood partially hidden in the shadows, clutching something close to his chest. The boy's clothes were oversized, his hair tousled, and his posture tense, as though he were trying to blend into the brick wall behind him. Officer Mercer slowed his car, parking it a safe distance from the alley. He observed the boy's behavior for a moment, noting the way he seemed to guard the bundle in his arms, cradling it with the utmost care. There was something vulnerable and yet fiercely protective in his stance that tugged at Officer Mercer's heart. After a moment's pause, he stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his utility belt as he approached. "Hey there, son," he called softly, keeping his tone gentle so as not to startle the boy. "Everything all right?" The boy flinched but didn't run. He turned slowly, revealing two tiny, dark-skinned infants nestled in his arms. Officer Mercer's heart sank at the sight. The babies couldn't have been more than a few months old, and yet here they were, held by a young boy in a back alley, their tiny bodies wrapped in an old, thin blanket that barely covered them. "What's your name?" Mercer asked gently, keeping a respectful distance. "And who are these little ones?" The boy's gaze was wary, his body language hesitant, but after a moment, he answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm Liam, sir. And these are my little sisters." Officer Mercer noted the way Liam's grip tightened protectively around the babies, and he saw the exhaustion in the boy's eyes, a tiredness far beyond his years. His heart ached at the sight, but he kept his expression calm, careful not to alarm him. "Liam, are you in some kind of trouble?" Mercer asked, keeping his voice warm and steady. "I just want to help you and your sisters. You look like you could use some rest." Liam hesitated, his gaze darting from the officer's face to the alley's exit and back again. For a moment, it seemed he might try to flee. But then, perhaps sensing the sincerity in Mercer's eyes, he took a slow, shuddering breath and nodded. They're hungry," he admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. I didn't know where else to go. I just needed to keep them safe." Mercer crouched down to be at eye level with the boy, nodding in understanding. "Why don't we get you all somewhere warm? I can get you some food, and we can figure out the rest together. Does that sound all right?" Liam studied Mercer's face, his eyes filled with suspicion, fear, and a sliver of hope. Slowly, he nodded, adjusting the blanket around the infants as he allowed the officer to lead him to the patrol car. As they walked, Mercer couldn't help but marvel at the way Liam carried himself, with a quiet resilience that seemed to defy his young age. Once they were all safely seated in the car, Mercer glanced back at Liam and his two tiny charges, offering a reassuring smile. "We'll head to the station," he said, "just to make sure you all have what you need. And don't worry, I'll be with you the whole time." As they drove, Liam's story began to unfold in fragments, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He spoke of an overcrowded orphanage on the other side of town, where he'd been placed after his parents passed away in a tragic accident. It wasn't a place of kindness or care, he explained. It was cold, harsh, and unkind, especially to his sisters, whom he had vowed to protect from the moment they were placed in his arms. "They're the only family I have left," he whispered, glancing down at the sleeping babies in his lap. "They needed me, and I couldn't leave them there. Not after what I saw." Mercer's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his heart heavy with the weight of the boy's words. He didn't press for details, sensing that Liam was only sharing what he felt he could. Instead, he offered a quiet nod of understanding, reassuring the boy that he was safe now, that his sisters were safe, and that no one would hurt them again. As they neared the station, Mercer's mind was already racing with questions. What kind of place would allow such a young child to take on the responsibility of caring for two infants? And what horrors had driven Liam to such desperate measures? When they arrived, Mercer led Liam and the babies into the warmth of the station's break room, where he quickly gathered food, water, and blankets. He watched as Liam carefully fed each of the infants with a tenderness that belied his young age, his every movement filled with a quiet determination to keep them safe. The sight stirred something deep within Mercer. He could see that this was no ordinary boy. This was a child who had been forced to grow up too soon, a young soul burdened with responsibilities far beyond his years. And as he watched Liam tend to the babies, a fierce resolve began to grow in his heart. No matter what it took, he would do everything in his power to protect these children, to give them the chance at a life they deserved, a life filled with love, security, and the warmth of a true family. And he knew, without a doubt, that he had been placed in Liam's path for a reason. As the boy's quiet words echoed in his mind, Mercer made a silent vow to himself and to the three vulnerable lives now in his care. He would not rest until they were safe. A glimpse into the past. The quiet hum of the police station was a stark contrast to the chaos that often filled its walls. Officer Mercer had led Liam and the babies to a small, cozy room usually reserved for staff meetings or impromptu breaks. He carefully shut the door, offering the little family a moment of privacy. He had no idea what Liam and his sisters had endured, but he was determined to protect them and to find out exactly what had driven Liam to take such drastic measures. Liam sat in a large chair, the two infants nestled securely in his lap. As he held each of them close, he seemed momentarily at peace, the tense lines in his young face softening in the warmth of the room. Officer Mercer watched him from a respectful distance, noting the way Liam's arms wrapped protectively around the babies, his posture as fierce and guarded as a soldier's. "Can I get you anything to eat, Liam?" Mercer asked softly, not wanting to break the spell of safety that had finally enveloped the boy. "Maybe something warm for the little ones." Liam glanced up, his gaze wary but grateful. "Do you have formula?" he asked in a small voice. "They haven't eaten much, just what I could find." I didn't want to take too much." Mercer nodded, his chest tightening at the boy's words. He stepped out for a moment, hurrying down the hallway to the station's supply room, where he found a stash of baby formula, bottles, and clean diapers. He quickly gathered what he needed and returned to the room, finding Liam still sitting in the chair, whispering softly to the babies as they cooed and squirmed in his arms. "Here you go," Mercer said, setting the supplies down on a nearby table. "I'll help you get them fed. And then maybe you can get a bite to eat too." Liam nodded, carefully shifting the babies so that Mercer could help prepare the bottles. As they worked, a heavy silence settled over the room, filled only by the soft sounds of the baby's gentle breathing and Liam's quiet whispers. When Mercer handed him the first bottle, Liam's face lit up with a look of relief and gratitude that tugged at the officer's heart. "You're doing a good job, Liam," Mercer said gently, watching as the boy fed the first baby, her tiny fingers reaching up to grasp his shirt. "But I have to ask, why did you leave the orphanage? What happened there?" Liam's expression shifted, his gaze dropping to the floor as he swallowed hard. "It wasn't safe," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not for me, and not for them." Mercer felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had heard rumors about some of the local orphanages, places where children were supposedly cared for, but were instead neglected, even mistreated. He'd always assumed those rumors were exaggerated, the result of disgruntled former residents or dissatisfied employees. But now, looking at the wary, haunted expression on Liam's face, he wondered if there was more truth to those stories than he'd realized. "What do you mean, Liam?" Mercer pressed, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "Did someone hurt you or your sisters?" Liam's grip tightened around the bottle, his jaw clenching as he shook his head. It's not just hurting, sir," he said softly. "It's forgetting, ignoring, like we're invisible." His voice trembled, a mixture of frustration and sadness seeping into his words. "They don't care if we eat, if we're warm, if we're safe. I was the one who took care of them. Me. No one else." Mercer's fists clenched at his sides, his heart aching at the boy's words. He had always known that life wasn't easy for children in the system, but hearing Liam's story made the reality of it all the more painful. "They're my family," Liam continued, his voice breaking as he glanced down at the babies in his arms. "I couldn't leave them there. Not after everything I saw." Mercer sat down across from Liam, leaning forward with a gentle expression. "Tell me, Liam, what happened that made you decide to leave? I promise, you can trust me." For a long moment, Liam was silent, his gaze fixed on the floor as he gathered his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raw whisper that carried the weight of memories far too heavy for a boy his age. "It started a few months ago," he began, glancing up at Mercer with a haunted look in his eyes. "After my parents, after the accident, they'd brought me to the orphanage. I didn't know anyone, didn't know what was going to happen to me. I was scared and alone." He paused, his lips trembling as he fought to keep his composure. "But then I saw them, Lisa and May. They were so small, so helpless. No one took care of them. They'd cry all night, and no one would come." Mercer felt his chest tighten as he imagined the scene Liam was describing, the loneliness and fear the boy must have felt in that cold, uncaring place. He could see now why Liam had taken on the role of protector, why he had risked everything to shield his sisters from harm. "One night, I decided to check on them myself," Liam continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I snuck into the nursery and found them shivering, wrapped in these thin blankets that barely kept them warm. I held them until they stopped crying. And from that night on, I did everything I could to take care of them." Mercer nodded, his heart aching for the young boy who had been forced to grow up far too soon. "You did a brave thing, Liam," he said softly. "But what happened after that? Why did you feel you had to leave?" Liam's expression darkened, a flash of anger crossing his face. "Miss Alder, the woman who runs the orphanage, she doesn't like babies. Especially ones that look different," he whispered, his voice laced with bitterness. "She'd make these comments, say things that weren't right. She didn't want to give them formula, said it was a waste. So I'd sneak into the kitchen at night to get what they needed." Mercer clenched his jaw, struggling to contain the anger bubbling up inside him. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his career, but the thought of someone mistreating innocent children like Liam and his sisters was almost more than he could bear. "One night, I heard her talking on the phone," Liam continued, his voice shaking. "She was talking about sending them away. Somewhere worse. Somewhere where they wouldn't come back." His voice broke, tears streaming down his face as he looked up at Mercer with pleading eyes. "I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let them take my sisters away." Mercer felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him as he reached out to place a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Liam," he said firmly. "You did everything you could to keep them safe, and I promise you, I'll make sure they never go back to that place." Liam's eyes widened, a flicker of hope lighting up his face. "You mean it, sir," he whispered. "You'll keep us safe?" Mercer nodded, his gaze filled with determination. "Yes, Liam. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you and your sisters safe, but I'll need your help too. I'll need you to tell me everything you can about what happened at that orphanage, so we can make sure no other child has to go through what you did." Liam took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he met Mercer's eyes. "I'll tell you everything," he said softly. I just want to make sure no one else gets hurt." As Liam began to recount his experiences, Mercer listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of the boy's words. Each story, each memory, painted a chilling picture of the orphanage, a place where children were treated as burdens, where kindness was rare and compassion was non-existent. The more Mercer heard, the more determined he became to take action, to expose the horrors that Liam and his sisters had endured. When Liam finished his story, he looked up at Mercer with a mixture of hope and fear. What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mercer reached out, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "For now, you're safe. I'll make sure of it. And tomorrow, I'll start an investigation into that orphanage. We'll make sure that no child has to suffer there ever again." Liam nodded, relief flooding his face as he finally allowed himself to relax. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for the first time since they had met, he looked like a child again, a child who had finally found someone he could trust. As Mercer watched Liam hold his sister's clothes, he made a silent vow to himself and to the children in his care. He would protect them, no matter what it took. And he would fight to bring justice to every child who had suffered in silence, their cries unheard in the darkness. Outside, the sky had darkened, the last traces of sunlight fading into the night. But within the small, cozy room, a new hope had been kindled, a hope that would guide them through the challenges that lay ahead. Uncovering the shadows. The early morning light spilled across Officer Mercer's desk, casting a warm glow over the scattered notes and reports he had hurriedly assembled in preparation for the day. After Liam and the babies had been settled safely in a temporary foster home the night before, Mercer had stayed late at the station, combing through files and making calls to anyone he thought could help. Now, as he glanced over at the photograph of his own family on his desk, a steely resolve settled over him. He was going to bring the truth about this orphanage to light, no matter the cost. With a firm grip on his coffee mug, Mercer made his way down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early hour. He needed to get this investigation underway before the regular hustle of the day could interrupt him. His first stop was the office of his friend and colleague, Detective Sarah Lowell. A skilled investigator known for her empathy and tenacity, she was the perfect person to help him crack open the mystery surrounding Grace Haven Orphanage. He tapped lightly on her office door, and after a brief pause, it swung open to reveal Sarah's surprised face. She raised an eyebrow at him, a wry smile on her lips. "Mercer, you're in early," she said, setting down a stack of files. "What brings you here before sunrise?" "Sarah, I need your help," he replied, his tone urgent. "I got a situation with an orphanage that's, well, it's bad. Really bad." He explained what Liam had told him, watching as Sarah's expression shifted from mild interest to deep concern. "Are you telling me kids are being neglected and even abused there?" she asked, her tone laced with anger. "And nobody's done anything about it?" Mercer nodded, a heavy sigh escaping him. "It seems that way. But it's even worse than neglect. The things Liam described, the isolation, the lack of food, the outright hostility. It's like the people in charge just don't see these kids as human, especially the ones who don't fit a certain look." Sarah's eyes flashed with determination as she reached for her phone. "Well, we're not going to let this slide. I'll start looking into records of complaints filed against the orphanage. Maybe there's a paper trail, something we can use to open an official investigation." "Thank you, Sarah," Mercer said, relief flooding his face. "I knew I could count on you." As Sarah began making calls and pulling up files, Mercer sat across from her, jotting down notes on the information she uncovered. An hour passed in a blur of paperwork, and with each new detail, Mercer felt his resolve harden. There were records of minor complaints from years prior, all logged but dismissed, and occasional reports from social workers noting the orphanage's lack of resources. Yet nothing substantial had been done, and no formal investigation had ever been launched. "Looks like the administration at Grace Haven has friends in high places," Sarah muttered, her fingers flying over the keyboard. They managed to stay under the radar for a long time, probably because nobody was watching too closely. Mercer clenched his jaw, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Well, they're under the radar no more," he said firmly. "With Liam's account and these records, we have enough to pay them a visit and start asking some hard questions." Sarah nodded in agreement, gathering a folder of documents she had compiled. "I'll come with you. This place needs to answer for what it's done to those kids." Together, they left the station and headed toward Grace Haven Orphanage. The drive was filled with quiet anticipation, the weight of what they might uncover heavy on their minds. As they approached the old Victorian building, Mercer felt a chill run down his spine. The place looked worn and unwelcoming, its once beautiful facade marred by neglect and disrepair. It was hard to believe that this crumbling structure was meant to be a sanctuary for children. The orphanage's administrator, Ms. Hazel Alder, met them at the door. She was a thin, severe-looking woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that darted between Mercer and Sarah, as if assessing them. Her expression was tight, her smile forced, and Mercer noted the way her fingers fidgeted with the keys on her belt. "Good morning, officers," she greeted them with a clipped tone. "What brings you here today?" "Ms. Alder, we're here to discuss some concerns that have been raised about the conditions at Grace Haven," Mercer replied, keeping his tone professional but firm. "We'd like to see the facilities and speak with the children." Ms. Alder's expression barely shifted, but Mercer noticed a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Our children are well cared for," she replied, her voice laced with irritation. "I assure you, we follow all required guidelines. I'd appreciate it if you could let us conduct our work without unnecessary interruptions." Sarah stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Ms. Alder, we've received reports from former residents and community members expressing serious concerns about the treatment of children here," she said calmly. "If you have nothing to hide, then I'm sure you won't mind showing us around." A tense silence stretched between them before Ms. Alder finally nodded, gesturing for them to follow. "Very well," she said, her tone cold. "I'll show you our facilities, but I hope this will dispel whatever rumors you've heard." As they walked through the orphanage, Mercer's heart sank. The walls were bare, painted in a dull, washed-out gray that seemed to drain the life from the rooms. The furniture was sparse and worn, with no signs of warmth or comfort that a home for children should have. Each room they passed was eerily silent, devoid of laughter or the usual noises of childhood. It was as though the children had learned to make themselves invisible. When they reached the nursery, Mercer noticed the cribs lined up against the wall, each one filled with thin, scratchy blankets that looked as if they hadn't been washed in weeks. A few of the younger children lay listlessly in their cribs, their expressions blank, their eyes dull and lifeless. He felt a pang of sorrow at the sight, his fists clenching at his sides. "Where are the other children?" Sarah asked, her gaze sharp as she scanned the empty play areas and classrooms. "There were supposed to be more here." Ms. Alder's face tightened, her eyes narrowing as she replied, "They're attending their morning lessons. We keep a strict schedule here, you see. It ensures discipline and order." Mercer exchanged a glance. They returned to the station, where Mercer made arrangements for the girls' care and contacted Child Protective Services to formally launch an investigation into Grace Haven. As he watched the young girl settle into a chair, her fear gradually fading as she realized she was finally safe, he felt a sense of hope rise within him. There was still much to be done, but he was determined to see this through. That evening, as he checked in on Liam and his sisters in their temporary foster home, he saw the relief in Liam's eyes, the quiet gratitude that needed no words. He knelt beside the boy, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's over, Liam," he said softly. "You and your sisters are safe now, and I'll make sure it stays that way." Liam nodded, a small smile breaking through his weary expression. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that his days of running, of hiding and fearing, were finally behind him. And as Mercer watched the boy and his sisters settle into the warmth of their new home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. Allies and revelations. The atmosphere at the station was charged with a mix of urgency and determination as Officer Mercer and Detective Sarah Lowell worked through a growing pile of documents and witness statements. Their investigation into Grace Haven had uncovered a bleak reality, one that painted a picture far worse than either had anticipated. Despite their years of experience, both found themselves reeling from the evidence, the weight of each new detail pressing down like a heavy burden on their shoulders. Word had quickly spread throughout the station about the young children at the orphanage and the horrific conditions under Ms. Alder's management. Officers who had never before shown an interest in child welfare cases were now rallying around Mercer and Sarah, lending a hand wherever they could. As Mercer finished a phone call with a social worker from Child Protective Services, he looked over at Sarah, who was reading through yet another witness statement with a frown. "I just spoke with CPS," he said, setting the phone down with a sigh. "They're sending a team out to Grace Haven today, but from what they told me, there's a lot of red tape. It might take time to fully remove Ms. Alder and shut down the place." Sarah glanced up from her file, her eyes dark with frustration. "I can't believe it. After everything we found, it's still not enough to act immediately. How many children have to suffer while we wait for the system to catch up?" Mercer ran a hand through his hair, nodding in agreement. "That's what I'm worried about too. But CPS assured me they're prioritizing this case." He paused, his gaze drifting to a small picture frame on his desk, a photo of his family smiling back at him. The thought of any child enduring what Liam and the other children had faced tore at him. Just then, the door to the station swung open, and a tall, middle-aged woman with a stern expression and a no-nonsense air strode in. She wore a crisp blazer and carried a leather briefcase, her gaze sharp as it swept across the room. Mercer straightened, recognizing her immediately. "Ms. Evelyn Hayes," he greeted, extending a hand. She was a well-respected attorney known for her work advocating for children's rights, and she had a reputation for taking on the toughest cases, often pro bono, if she believed in the cause. "Officer Mercer," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I received your message and came as soon as I could." She turned to Sarah, who introduced herself before quickly briefing Evelyn on the situation at Grace Haven. Evelyn's expression darkened as she listened, her jaw clenched with barely contained anger. "I've heard of Grace Haven before," she said, her tone steely. "It's been on my radar for a while, but without direct evidence, I couldn't make a move. Your testimonies from Liam and the other children are exactly what I need to take action." Sarah glanced at Mercer, a flicker of relief passing over her face. "So what can we do to speed this along?" she asked, her voice brimming with urgency. Evelyn set her briefcase down, opening it to pull out a stack of legal documents. "First, we'll file an emergency petition to transfer the children from Grace Haven to safer facilities. We'll push for immediate hearings to ensure no child has to spend another night there. I'll need witness statements from anyone who can testify about the conditions. The more voices we have, the stronger our case will be." Mercer nodded, his mind racing as he considered the possibilities. "We can get statements from Liam and the other children we've already spoken to. I'm sure there are others in the community who've seen or heard things over the years." Evelyn's gaze softened slightly. "It sounds like you're doing everything you can to protect these children. I wish more officers shared your dedication. We'll need every bit of support we can gather, especially when we face Ms. Alder and her network." As Evelyn organized her files, Sarah moved closer to Mercer, lowering her voice. "You think she'll fight this?" "She'll do more than that," Mercer replied quietly, his gaze fixed on the grim notes in front of him. "From what we've learned, Ms. Alder has connections in local government. It's no wonder the complaints against her have been buried for years." Evelyn, overhearing them, nodded. "Ms. Alder knows how to play the game. She's evaded accountability for years by fostering relationships with influential people. It's possible that some of them even benefit financially from the orphanage." Sarah's eyes widened. "Are you saying there's money involved?" Evelyn sighed, her gaze hardening. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the first time. Orphanages are supposed to be non-profit organizations, but I've seen cases where the administration funnels donations and government funding into their own pockets. If that's the case with Grace Haven, it could be the reason for the neglect, and the reason no one's been willing to stop it. Mercer clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. So it's not just neglect, it's deliberate. And all the while, kids like Liam and his sisters suffer. Yes, Evelyn replied softly, her expression filled with a quiet determination. But that ends now. I'll make sure of it. They spent the next few hours gathering statements from the children who had been removed from Grace Haven, along with testimonies from former staff members who had seen or suspected abuse, but had been too afraid to speak up. Mercer watched as the statements piled up, each one adding to the grim picture they were building. A portrait of an institution that had been allowed to fester in silence. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn gathered her files, a determined gleam in her eyes. "This is enough to get us started," she said, her tone resolute. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be filing our petition. With any luck, the judge will order an emergency removal of all children from Grace Haven." Mercer felt a surge of gratitude as he shook Evelyn's hand. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. You don't know how much this means to these kids." She smiled faintly, a rare warmth in her otherwise stoic expression. "They deserve justice, Officer Mercer. And I'll do everything in my power to make sure they get it." As Evelyn left the station, Mercer and Sarah exchanged a look, both of them feeling a renewed sense of hope. They were finally making progress, finally putting into motion the wheels that would bring down the walls of Grace Haven. The following morning, as they waited anxiously for news from Evelyn, Mercer decided to pay a visit to Liam and his sisters. He knew the boy would be anxious, worried about what might happen now that they had revealed the truth about Grace Haven. He wanted to reassure him, to let him know that he and his sisters were safe. When Mercer arrived at the temporary foster home, he was greeted by the warm smile of Mrs. Hargrove, a retired teacher who had been fostering children for years. She led him into the living room, where Liam sat on the floor, his sisters beside him. The boy looked up at Mercer with a mixture of hope and fear, his eyes searching the officer's face for any sign of good news. "Hey, Liam," Mercer said softly, sitting down beside him. "How are you and the little ones holding up?" Liam managed a small smile, his hand resting protectively on one of the baby's heads. "We're okay," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But do we have to go back to Grace Haven?" Mercer placed a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder. "No, Liam, you won't have to go back. I promise you that." Liam's eyes filled with relief, and he exhaled a shaky breath. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. I don't know what I would have done if I had to go back there." Mercer's heart ached as he saw the depth of Liam's relief, the sheer weight of the fear the boy had been carrying. He knew that Liam's journey to healing would be long and difficult, but he was determined to be there for him every step of the way. Just then, Mercer's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Sarah. "Emergency petition granted. Judge approved immediate removal of all children from Grace Haven. It's over." A surge of triumph washed over Mercer as he read the message. He looked up at Liam, his smile widening. "It's done, Liam. Grace Haven is being shut down, and all the kids are being moved to safe places." Liam's face lit up with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Really? It's really over?" Mercer nodded, his own heart swelling with relief. "Yes, Liam, it's really over. No more hiding. No more fear." For the first time, Liam allowed himself to truly smile, a smile that reached his eyes and filled the room with a warmth that had been absent for far too long. He hugged his sisters close, his voice trembling as he whispered, "We're safe now. We're really safe." As Mercer watched the small family embrace, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that he had done something truly meaningful. He had kept his promise to Liam, and in doing so, He had helped bring down a place of darkness that had caused so much pain. But he knew his work wasn't over. There were still investigations to be completed, still people to hold accountable. And there was still the matter of finding a permanent home for Liam and his sisters, a family who would give them the love and security they so desperately needed. And as he left the foster home that evening, Mercer made another promise to himself. He would find that family for Liam and his sisters. He would see to it that their lives were filled with the love and kindness they had been denied for so long. For now, though, he would savor the victory they had achieved, a victory born of courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest places, there was always hope. Justice served new beginnings. The courtroom was a solemn, intimidating space, its tall windows casting muted sunlight over the rows of benches where community members and press gathered, whispering in low voices. At the front of the room sat Ms. Hazel Alder, her usual stern expression replaced with one of defiance and cold disdain. Dressed in a severe dark suit, she glared across the room at the gathered officials and reporters, her jaw clenched tightly. Officer Mercer sat in the audience alongside Detective Sarah Lowell and Attorney Evelyn Hayes, who had been instrumental in bringing the case against Grace Haven to trial. Mercer's heart beat steadily as he watched the judge enter the room, signaling for silence. The past weeks had been grueling, filled with interviews, hearings, and emotional statements from the children, including Liam, who had bravely recounted the horrors he'd witnessed. Now, they were here, ready to see justice done. As the judge took her seat, she looked out over the courtroom, her gaze sharp and unyielding. We are here today to address the charges against Ms. Hazel Alder, the administrator of Grace Haven Orphanage, who stands accused of child neglect, abuse, and gross misconduct. A hush fell over the room as Evelyn rose, her calm, commanding presence filling the space as she presented her opening statement. Your Honor, we are here to seek justice for the children of Grace Haven. Evelyn began, her voice strong and steady. The evidence we present today will paint a disturbing picture of an institution that failed in its most basic duty, to care for vulnerable children. The testimonies from both current and former residents of Grace Haven reveal a culture of cruelty, neglect, and racism under Ms. Alder's administration, a culture that no child should ever have to endure. Evelyn's words reverberated through the courtroom, and as she began laying out the evidence, Mercer felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude for her dedication. She presented document after document, outlining years of neglect and abuse, as well as witness statements from children like Liam and the young girl they had found locked in the storage room. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the suffering that had been hidden behind the orphanage's walls. Then it was Ms. Alder's turn to speak. She rose slowly, her face twisted into a defiant scowl as she attempted to justify her actions. Your Honor, she began, her voice icy, I ran Grace Haven for nearly 20 years. I did the best I could with limited resources, and I resent the implication that I mistreated any child. These accusations are nothing more than exaggerations from children who don't understand the challenges of running an orphanage. Mercer clenched his fists, his anger simmering as he listened to her words. The audacity, the lack of remorse, it was almost unbearable. But as he glanced over at Evelyn, who remained calm and collected, he felt a surge of confidence. She wasn't about to let Ms. Alder's excuses stand unchallenged. When Evelyn rose again to cross-examine, she approached Ms. Alder with an unflinching gaze. Ms. Alder, she said, her tone steely, do you deny that you withheld food and basic necessities from the children under your care? Ms. Alder scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. I did what was necessary to maintain order. Those children needed discipline, and sometimes that meant restricting privileges. Privileges. Evelyn's voice was filled with quiet outrage. Are you suggesting that basic human necessities, food, warmth, and a safe environment, are privileges that you could revoke at will? Ms. Alder's silence was damning, her gaze dropping as Evelyn's words cut through the courtroom. One by one, Evelyn dismantled each of Ms. Alder's defenses, revealing the cruelty and neglect that had festered within Grace Haven. The judge listened intently, her expression growing increasingly severe as the evidence mounted. By the end of the day, there was little doubt in anyone's mind that Ms. Alder would be held accountable for her actions. As the judge delivered the verdict, sentencing Ms. Alder to prison time and ordering the permanent closure of Grace Haven, a wave of relief washed over Mercer. Justice had been served, and the children were finally free from Ms. Alder's oppressive rule. After the hearing, Evelyn approached Mercer and Sarah, her expression softened with a rare smile. "We did it," she said, her voice tinged with satisfaction. "Justice is finally on their side." Mercer nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "Thank you, Evelyn. Without you, none of this would have been possible." Evelyn waved his gratitude away. It was a team effort. "And now we need to focus on the future, ensuring that these children find real homes where they'll be loved and cared for." With Ms. Alder removed and Grace Haven closed, Mercer turned his attention to the children, especially Liam, and his siblings, who had become like family to him. He knew that the foster system was often unpredictable, and he was determined to find a stable, loving home for Liam, Eliza, and May. They had already been through so much, and he couldn't bear the thought of them being shuffled from one place to another. As he drove to the foster home where they were staying, Mercer thought back to the night he had found them in that alley. He remembered the fear in Liam's eyes, the way he had clutched his sisters as though he were their only shield against the world. And in a way he had been. Liam's courage, his fierce love for his sisters, had been what saved them. When he arrived, he was greeted by Mrs. Hargrove, who led him into the living room, where Liam sat playing with his sisters on the carpet. The babies were giggling, their chubby hands reaching for Liam, who looked up with a smile as he saw Mercer enter. "Officer Mercer," Liam exclaimed, standing up as the babies continued to babble and coo at him. Did they do it? Is Ms. Alder gone?" Mercer knelt down to Liam's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, Liam. Ms. Alder won't be hurting anyone ever again. Grace Haven is closed for good." Liam's face lit up, his eyes shining with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Mercer smiled, his heart warmed by the boy's joy. "I didn't do it alone. You were the brave one, Liam. You protected your sisters and stood up to people who did wrong. That takes real strength." Liam nodded, his expression thoughtful as he looked down at his sisters, who were still playing happily on the floor. I just want them to be safe," he said softly. "I want us to be together, somewhere where we can be a family." Mercer's heart ached at the sincerity in Liam's voice, and he knew he had to take the next step. He had been thinking about this decision for days, and now, seeing Liam's face, he knew it was the right one. "Liam," Mercer began, his voice gentle but filled with determination, "how would you feel about coming to live with me and my wife? Permanently. We've talked about it, and we'd love to have you and your sisters join our family if that's what you want." Liam's eyes widened in disbelief, his face lighting up with a mixture of joy and shock. You really mean it?" he stammered, his voice filled with hope. We could be a real family." Mercer nodded, his own heart pounding with emotion. "Yes, Liam. We'd be honored to have you as part of our family. You and your sisters deserve a home filled with love, and we'd love to give you that." A tear slipped down Liam's cheek as he whispered, Yes, I want that more than anything." He threw his arms around Mercer, hugging him tightly as relief and happiness flooded his heart. For the first time in his life, he felt safe, truly safe, and he knew that he had found a place where he and his sisters could finally belong. In the weeks that followed, Mercer and his wife, Maria, went through the adoption process, pouring their hearts into creating a warm and welcoming home for their new family. They transformed a spare room into a cozy nursery for Eliza and May, painting the walls a soft yellow and filling it with toys and blankets. They bought Liam his first bed and gave him his own space, decorating it with posters and books that reflected his love for reading and adventure. Each day, Mercer watched as Liam settled into his new life, growing more confident, more joyful with each passing moment. Eliza and May flourished as well, their laughter filling the house as they explored their new surroundings, delighted by every new discovery. For the first time, they had a family, a home where they were loved and cherished. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Maria leaned over to Liam, who was happily telling a story about his day at school. "Liam," she said softly, "we're so proud of you. You're an incredible big brother, and you've shown such strength and courage. You're part of our family now, forever." Liam beamed, his eyes shining with happiness. "Thank you, Mom," he replied, his voice filled with love. It was the first time he had called her that, and Maria's eyes filled with tears of joy as she hugged him tightly. As they held each other close, Mercer looked around at his new family, his heart brimming with gratitude. He had set out to protect these children, to save them from a place of darkness and despair, and in the process, he had gained something even more precious. He had found a family, a love that bound them all together, stronger than anything they had faced. The shadows of Grace Haven were behind them, replaced by a future filled with hope, laughter, and the promise of a new beginning. And as the sun set outside their home, Mercer knew that they were finally where they were meant to be, together as a family. The journey home. It had been nearly a year since Liam, Eliza, and May had come to live with Officer Mercer and Maria, yet the memories of Grace Haven's cold, unforgiving walls still lingered in small ways. Sometimes, Liam would wake in the middle of the night, his heart racing, half expecting to find himself back in the orphanage, clutching his sisters in the dark. But each time, he'd hear Maria's gentle voice from down the hall or feel the warmth of his soft, new bed. He'd take a deep breath, calming himself, reminding himself that he was home. The warmth and security of family had begun to seep into Liam's bones, slowly erasing the fear and sadness he had once carried like a heavy weight. Eliza and May, though too young to remember much, had blossomed under the Mercers' loving care. The babies were a bundle of energy, their laughter echoing through the house as they toddled from room to room, clutching their favorite toys and babbling in their own secret language. The Mercers' modest home had become a sanctuary for the three siblings, each room infused with love and care. Maria had turned a once-empty room into a cozy nursery for the girls, filling it with soft blankets, stuffed animals, and storybooks. She had painted the walls a soothing shade of sky blue, and stars adorned the ceiling, glowing faintly in the dark, like a promise of dreams fulfilled. Liam's room had become his personal haven, decorated with posters of adventure books, a small desk for his studies, and shelves filled with books that Mercer had gifted him. One wall held a photo of him, Eliza, May, and the Mercers together on their first family outing, a trip to the local zoo, where they had spent the day laughing and marveling at the animals. It was a simple day, but for Liam, it had felt like a glimpse into a world he'd never known, a world of safety, of love, and of belonging. One Saturday morning, as the autumn leaves cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, the Mercers decided to spend the day at the local park. It had become a family tradition, a way to let the children explore, play, and grow more comfortable with their surroundings. As they walked to the park, Liam held Eliza's hand, while May toddled along, her tiny fingers clutching Mercer's hand tightly. Maria walked beside them, a gentle smile on her face as she watched her children, her family. When they arrived, the children ran off toward the playground, their laughter filling the crisp autumn air. Liam pushed May on the swing, his face alight with joy as he listened to her delighted squeals. Mercer and Maria watched from a nearby bench, their hands intertwined, their eyes filled with quiet pride. "They've come so far, haven't they?" Maria whispered, her gaze fixed on Liam, as he gently lifted Eliza onto the small slide. "He's already such a good big brother. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for him to take care of his sisters alone." Mercer nodded, his heart swelling with admiration. He had to grow up so fast. But he's a strong kid, one of the strongest I've ever known. And now he finally has the chance to be a child again, to be carefree. Maria leaned her head against Mercer's shoulder, her voice filled with gratitude. I feel like we're the ones who've been blessed, having them in our lives. They've taught us so much about resilience, about love. And I know they still have a long way to go, but I believe they'll find healing here. Mercer smiled, squeezing her hand. I believe that too. Later that evening, after the children had been bathed and tucked into bed, Liam lingered by his sister's room, watching as they drifted into a peaceful sleep. He marveled at how different their lives had become, how safe and warm they were in this house filled with love. He had never imagined that such a place could exist, much less that it could belong to him and his sisters. As he turned to head back to his own room, he saw Mercer standing in the hallway, a gentle smile on his face. "Can't sleep yet?" Mercer asked, his voice soft. Liam shook his head. "Just making sure they're okay," he replied, glancing back at his sister's room. Mercer nodded, understanding the instinct all too well. "They're okay, Liam. And they have you to thank for that." Liam looked down, a shy smile playing on his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you either. You saved us." Mercer's heart ached with pride and love as he placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "You saved them, Liam. You were their hero when they needed one the most. And now you get to just be a kid. You've earned it." The two of them shared a quiet moment, the bond between them deepening in the silence. For Liam, Mercer had become more than a protector. He had become the father he'd always dreamed of, the one he'd thought he would never find. And for Mercer, Liam was more than just a boy he had rescued. He was his son, his family, a light that had come into his life when he least expected it. Over the following months, Liam and his sisters settled even more comfortably into their new life, their bond with the Mercers strengthening with each passing day. Birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes and laughter, school achievements were proudly displayed on the fridge, and every night, Maria would read a bedtime story, her voice soothing the children into peaceful sleep. Yet, as happy as Liam was, there were moments when the shadows of his past would resurface. Sometimes, he'd wake up in the night, startled by memories of the orphanage, his heart racing as he remembered the dark hallways, the cold nights, and the fear that had once haunted him. But each time, he would remind himself that he was safe now, that he had a family who loved him. One night, as he lay awake, he heard a soft knock on his door. It was Maria, her face gentle and understanding, as she entered the room. "Can't sleep, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Liam nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of worry and sadness. "Sometimes, I still feel like I'm back there," he admitted softly, "like it was all a dream, and I'll wake up and be back in the orphanage." Maria reached out, gently taking his hand. "I understand, Liam. It's hard to leave those memories behind. But I want you to know that you're safe here. This is your home, and we are your family. No one will ever take that away from you." Liam looked up at her, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Really? Really?" Maria replied, her voice filled with warmth. "You are ours, Liam. You and your sisters. We love you, and we're here for you always." Liam's heart swelled with a love that was almost overwhelming, a love he had once thought was only for other people, for other families. But now it was his, and he knew, deep down, that he was finally home. As the years passed, the memories of Grace Haven faded, replaced by new memories filled with love and laughter. Liam grew taller, his confidence blossoming as he excelled in school and made friends. Eliza and May thrived as well, their bright smiles and endless curiosity, a testament to the love and care they received from their new family. Each day, Mercer and Maria watched with pride as their children grew, their hearts full of gratitude for the family they had created. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, And yet, they had become a family stronger than any challenge they could face. And so, as the sun set over their home each evening, casting a warm glow over the cozy rooms and the laughter-filled hallways, Liam, Eliza, and May knew that they had finally found a place where they belonged. They were loved, they were safe, and they were home.